Alright, so this video is going to be a review of the American Civil War. So, as you would know, the American Civil War is really between, the North or the Union or the newly seceded Southern states, which were also known as now the Confederate States of America. And here's just a little bit of general information about the two sides, and really to show some of the differences between the two. For starters, the North or the Union had a much larger population. Right here it says about 22 million people in comparison to the South, where they had about 9 million people. And that's a big difference right off the bat. The population size of almost of more than double. That's going to make it be a major advantage for the North throughout this war. And about 3.5 million of the people in the South, they were actually slaves. And the question really comes up here whether or not these slaves could be considered friendly or if they were foes. Obviously, they really didn't want to use them in battle because if they did, arming slaves could be majorly problematic to the Confederates, and it worried them. So really, they really only were left with significantly less than even what their total population was. The North, other areas that they had great manufacturing capabilities. Manufacturing, in this case, is going to play a major part as well in this war, when the North is able to pump out war resources much more quickly. Things like uniforms, ammunition, guns, arms, and such. Being able to pump those out at much faster rates is going to be able to really fuel your army. And then going with that, you had a much greater railway system in the North in comparison to the South. And that is also going to be majorly important because that railway is going to be able to move troops, but also going to be able to move those resources and supplies to the battlefield that the manufacturing is pumping out significantly more quickly than without it, and relying on rivers or just over the land transportation besides the railway. The railway is going to be a consistent, quick speed. That's going to be a major importance of this as well. So one other thing here is that the North, they're going to be the invading group here. They are the ones that really ultimately went to war, and are going to have to do something about what is going on. They're going to have to go and invade, and the area that they're invading is pretty large. Right here I say that it's larger than Western Europe, and the big difference here is that when you're invading, it's easier to lose morale and things like that depending on how it's going, but the Confederate soldiers off the bat are going to be extremely highly motivated. They're defending their homes and their families, and that right there is a highly motivating factor in itself. Continuing to talk about the both sides a little bit, on both sides, you really had a really big rush of recruits, enlisting into this, and ultimately both sides are going to institute a draft as well when those enlistments start to drop later in the war. And by 1865, you have a large number of soldiers that are actually in this fight and that have fought for the Union and the Confederacy. Overall, you have over 2 million Union troops and over about 900,000 Confederate troops. So again, that just really goes to show the differences in numbers, in just sheer numbers here, and those numbers are going to be a majorly important advantage for the Union, even though they're going to have a hard time really using that advantage until really late in the war. One thing that both of the groups really experienced is that there really hadn't been any major wars in the United States for a little while, really since the Mexican-American War, about 15 years or so earlier than this. So really, a few of the recruits really had any military experience, but these people that were joining up and enlisting were extremely enthusiastic. The idea of war that they actually had was still a really highly romantic view of war. But when it comes down to it, very few of these people were really ready for that military lifestyle. And that romantic view that they're going to have is going to kind of really start to disappear pretty quickly when you start throwing in the modern aspects of this war. So as I said in the beginning here on the title slide, this is really going to be the first modern war that the world sees. It's going to be kind of isolated from Europe, and that's why World War I is going to have such tremendous casualties and things like that with the newly modernized weapons and warfare. But this is really in the United States. The Civil War is really probably considered the first major big modern war. And really when it came down to it, both sides were really not prepared for the way technology was going to actually affect the war. As I was saying earlier, the railroads were going to be majorly important with transporting troops and supplies. Railroad junctions and railroads in general were going to become military targets that are going to need to be defended. You have the first ironclad battleships. In a major battle between the two that's pretty famous is this Merrimack versus the Monitor in 1862, and really these ironclad ships are essentially retrofitted wooden ships, and think of it like you're putting armor on a wooden ship in much in a similar way of a knight in medieval times would have worn armor, and it slows the ship down, but it ultimately allows it to take quite a bit of a larger punch from the big guns and stuff that these ships are able to have, and it's just one of these new modern technologies that you're going to see. Also, the telegraph is going to be really important for military communications. The telegraph, of course, is you have these telegraph lines, and it allows really for instant communication between these areas that these lines are laid. And the reason why that's going to be super important is the fact that you can have instant communication from a large distance is super important in warfare. And being able to have that communication, you can relay where people are, where they're going, and you can get that information right on the battlefield in certain cases, or at least nearby, and get that and relay that to where it needs to go in order to be ready for what you're going to be seeing. Also, you have air balloons that are going to be used for reconnaissance. So you're going to get your first aerial recon, which is really super important as well. They would actually take up these telegraph lines into the air balloons, and from that distance they could basically use the Morse code down and let people know what they see from that height, and they could see troop movements or anything like that from miles away in certain cases, and really relay some of that important information to the people below. So on this slide you can actually see some of these technologies. Right here you actually have the one of these ironclad ships. You can see the armor and the big guns coming from the side. They get the smoke, this stacks right here, that the smoke comes out of from burning the coal, that ultimately powers the ship. Down here you can see the railroad lines, and why a railroad would be ultimately important. And then this right here is a little a telegraph. So you can, this is how they would push the button down, and they would have a code that you could use, a Morse code, and read. You could read and listen to these beeps that they would make with dots and dashes, and be able to spread a message. Okay, so another major technology, and this is really one of the biggest changes in technology, is the replacement of a musket to rifles. And the big difference here is that muskets were typically smoothbore weapons, which meant that the inside was of the barrel was smooth, and that the bullet coming out of it would ultimately be fairly inaccurate, and it was really only good for pretty short ranges. So the difference is that the rifle is going to change that completely. So as you can see in here, you can actually see the rifling of the barrel, and why that's so important is that it would actually spin the bullet. And the bullet in spinning, actually would allow the bullet to travel significantly farther and significantly more accurate. So you go from being able to shoot, deadly at a pretty short range with the musket, to being able to shoot, up to 600 yards or in certain cases more, and deadly and accurately. So that's a major change, and the generals and the type of fighting is going to need to really make to change in order to be able to be ready for that type of difference on the battlefield. These rifles, as I just said, changed the nature of combat when it really comes down to it. And it really, because of how far you could now shoot, it started to emphasize the importance of fortifications and trenches. And because by doing so, this gave you a majorly defensive advantage. If you're going to be below ground in these trenches or in a fort that it's hard to hit because of just the way forts are, if you can shoot out a good distance with these rifles or some of these larger artillery pieces now, that's going to give you a significant advantage from the defensive. And these advancements that where we've been talking about really lead to some tremendous casualty numbers. You're talking battles where you're losing 20,000 people in certain cases, 20,000 casualties or more, and that's why you have really upwards of 700,000 deaths in this Civil War. There's many different estimates between 600,000, 700,000, maybe even some more, and that's roughly equivalent to about 5 million people today, if in United States percentage of population anyway. And another really problem was that medical care at the time was really not keeping up with the advances in technology. You didn't have germ theory discovered yet, so as far as sanitation, it wasn't great. And there's a quote here, that I believe doctors kill more than they cure, and that's partially because you had instances where they were spreading infection. They would actually take, someone who is being treated, and they would basically, they need to say they remove an arm, they might cut that arm off, and they'll go to the next person and use the same, tools to amputate something else on somebody else, spreading the germs into the blood and such, and not sanitizing the tools, and people would die from infection as a result of this more often because of the treatment than from the actual being shot in the battle. Both sides were really unprepared at the start of this war. You didn't have a national railroad gauge. What that means is that the different sizes of the tracks were a little bit different, and they were actually farther or closer apart. So you'd take one railway, and then you'd get to a spot where that train couldn't travel any farther because of this, and they would need to transfer to a different train and go on. You didn't have any national banking system. You didn't have a tax system in the beginning capable of raising the necessary funds to finance the war. Heck, the North didn't really even have accurate maps of the South. So part of being unprepared here is going to be problematic when you have all these new technologies that we were just talking about that are going to rapidly and very quickly change the nature of the combat that they had been used to. Once this war got started with the attack at Fort Sumter by the Confederates, you had the North put in place what's known as the Anaconda Plan. And the Anaconda Plan is a blockade of the South. And you're going to see it on my next slide, the extent of that with a bit of a political cartoon. But what happens is you have roughly 90 vessels at the start of the war, basically patrolling the coastline of the South, of the Confederates. And 90 vessels for many thousand miles of coastline isn't going to be super effective, and ultimately it's going to let some things through. But when it comes down to it, if it stops a ship here or there, if each vessel stops a ship, maybe one a year or more, ultimately as the war goes on, that's going to add up. And it wasn't very necessarily effective in the beginning, but as the war went on, those resources added up, and you started to get more vessels and such being appropriated for this. That the Anaconda Plan and the blockade really became a major thorn in the Confederate side because it really hurt their ability to have the supplies necessary to deal with this war. You also had initial difficulties of distributing the food and the weapons, and other supplies to the soldiers. And as the war went on, as a result of the production and the manufacturing and the railway system, the North actually got better at this, and the South actually struggled. They were able to import weapons and ultimately start their own manufacturing in certain cases. They got by, but the struggles are going to be really apparent later in the war. And as you can see here, you have just a picture of Scott's Great Snake. So this is Winfield Scott, his plan, this Anaconda Plan, to really ultimately choke off and strangle the South, and to keep them and prevent them from getting those supplies that they need. You can look really closely. You can see ships, and they're basically going to be making patrolling motions through their particular areas, attempting to block any ships from going into the South and such. And again, they were ultimately a little bit effective, but a little bit effective over a long period of time is going to really start to add up. Propaganda was also a really big thing, in this war, and both sides really used it, trying to influence and mobilize the, public opinion in favor of the war. But one thing that happened, to kind of prevent the propaganda from really taking full hold is that you also have the advent of photography here, and photography, when you get brutal pictures and war correspondents now being at these battles and taking pictures of the battles and the aftermath of the battles, and this brutal, harsh reality of what war looked like, and bringing that home to the places that wouldn't necessarily typically see this, you're going to have an immediate effect to the public and how they view the war. Newspapers, articles, and the photography really all play against this propaganda of getting people to try to sign up. And it's really interesting, how that relationship works. So as you can see here, this is just one of those instances of propaganda, and one of the photographs I was just talking about. If you look at this little poster here on the left, you can see, it's talking about the volunteers. They were paying people to sign up. Take the bounty while the opportunity lasts. You ultimately, if you sign up, you're going to get some money, kind of like a signing bonus. So why would you, not sign up? It's obviously a great deal. The draft is inevitable. They're saying that, ultimately, if the draft happens, you're not going to have a chance of getting this money. So it's trying to influence, the public opinion of getting them to sign up. And contrary to that, these pictures of the battles that you see, show those harsh realities, with showing soldiers dead, the reporters talking about the casualty numbers at the battles. It's going to kind of ultimately influence the public in the opposite direction. So now that we've talked about all those kind of initial things, we can kind of begin and talk about how this war ultimately shapes up. And you really have two major theaters of this war. You have the Eastern Theater and the Western Theater. And the Eastern Theater is really taking place really in a very narrow corridor, mostly between the two capitals of the Union and the Confederacy. You have Washington, D.C. and Richmond, and they're really only about 100 miles apart. This Northern Union Army, in this area, is known as the Army of the Potomac, and their aim is ultimately to take the capital, the Confederate capital at Richmond. And while this is the aim, you're going to have a lot of problems that the Union faces, and many of those problems stem from the fact that they just didn't have really good leaders for the most part of this in the beginning of this war. You have a major secession of generals. They don't hang around for too long. You have a number of generals before they kind of settle on Ulysses S. Grant as the main commander later in the war. So this is a map of kind of how the momentum in the battles kind of took place and started, in this war, in the Eastern Theater. This is a map. You have Virginia here. This is West Virginia. This is kind of the side of Maryland. You can see the capital right here, Richmond of the Confederacy, and the capital of D.C. And this is up here is Gettysburg. So you can really see, how this fighting is taking place in such a small area. And this is going to be 4 years here of fighting in these areas between the two big main parts of these armies, and we're going to be talking about how that kind of plays out more so in a second here. This is just another map of these battles. It also, does show the Western Theater here, which we're going to talk about again in a second. You can see the ships talking about the Union blockade. So, if you look really closely here, you can see, how this momentum kind of took place. You can see a little bit of a key up here to kind of explain this map for you. And this just kind of just shows you a little bit broader of a perspective of these early battles in the Civil War. So the first major big battle in the Civil War is known as First Manassas, or the First Battle of Bull Run, and that took place on July 21st in 1861. And overall, this was a big embarrassment for the Union. They have this grand army of the Republic, and ultimately they end up having a very chaotic retreat, back into Washington, D.C. The battle was going pretty well for them to start, but you get a major momentum shift, and it forces these guys all the way back to and running away. You have this, as I said, this chaotic retreat, and it's really funny because you actually had politicians and sightseers from D.C., because it wasn't really too far from the capital, coming out to actually watch this battle, kind of like you would almost a sporting event. They're ready, and you get this chaotic retreat of the Union soldiers through these people, and it's just an absolute mess. You have about 800 men killed in this battle, and by the war standards, it's going to ultimately become really low. But at the time, this was actually the bloodiest battle in American history, and the way this took place is it ultimately becomes, as I said, a major shock and embarrassment for the North. And it starts to, a little bit just worrisome, obviously. And Lincoln, as president, he begins to kind of call again for trying to get about a million men army to help fight in this war. After this battle, a man named George McClellan is going to assume the command of the Union Army. And one thing that McClellan is really known for, at least, is his reluctance to commit to a battle, and not taking advantage of the advantages that he had. But one thing that he needs to at least be given some praise for is that McClellan was very good at making an army work and getting them together and having them supplied, having the provisions, being drilled and trained properly, and he was very good at this. And in fact, he's going to take advantage of about a year of stall in a major battles here after this first big one, to really build the strength of the army. But that caution is going to really become a major thorn in Abraham Lincoln's side. So continuing with the Eastern Theater here, now after Bull Run, in 1862, you get a couple more battles that we're going to be talking about here as the major ones. There's obviously a lot more smaller battles, but we're just going to be talking about the big ones and how they shifted the momentum of this war. But as I was saying, Lincoln was obsessed with trying to get McClellan to attack. Lincoln was... The word is that Lincoln would spend long nights in the war telegraph office, studying up on war military strategy, and he recognized the advantage that the Union Army had, from a industrial standpoint and also just a sheer number standpoint, and he was really adamant about getting McClellan to take advantage of that. And so he with this pushing McClellan to do it, McClellan does make a move into Virginia, and with about 100,000 men, and ultimately Robert E. Lee, who's the main commander of the Confederate Army, he again pushes this Army of the Potomac back, towards Washington, D.C., and from there, Lee is going to go on the offensive. He hopes that by taking control of the border states, remember the border states are the states that remained in the Union who still actually had slavery, by taking control of these states, might be able to get them, on board with fighting for the Confederacy. It might also convince, and persuade Britain and France to join the war and help the Confederacy. There was this big belief about King Cotton, and that the cotton industry in the South was vital to, these European countries, so that if they didn't get this cotton, and these people would ultimately be worried about it and recognize the South and help them in the war. That was the hope, at least. So by making an offensive move here, he's hoping to convince them to actually get into the war. And that leads us to the Battle of Antietam, which took place on September 17th in 1862. You have Robert E. Lee launch this invasion of the North. And actually, by a major stroke of luck, you have Union soldiers actually find the orders of Lee dropped by a Confederate officer. I think they actually found it in some sort of a hut along the way. And they gave it to their commander, and McClellan got hold of this, and he was still ultimately cautious, even though he knew what was going to happen, or at least he thought he could know. I guess it could have been disinformation. Hey, this is what we're gonna do. We dropped it, we left it, but then we're gonna do something completely different and throw them off. But this caution allows Lee to gather even more forces before a major attack. And this is a big one. In fact, this is still the single most bloodiest day in American history, and that includes, D-Day in World War II and September 11th. The Union is actually victorious here. They repel Lee's advance, but the numbers are, a big difference compared to what we were just talking about. Remember, we just said that the First Manassas had the largest number of American dead in one day just before at 800. So we're talking over 4,000 people just killed outright, and 18,000 more casualties on top of that, of wounded. So casualty can mean actually someone who is killed outright or wounded. It's really someone who's being taken off the battlefield and no longer able to fight because of the bad health care we were just talking about before. Many of these people that are wounded are going to succumb to their wounds because of the infections and things like that they would get. And this is going to be... This right here is more men than in all American wars in the 19th century had been killed up to this point. And at this point, McClellan is going to be replaced with General Burnside. This is just a quick little quote down here about what it was like at Antietam. In the time that I am writing, every stalk of corn in the cornfields to the north was cut down as closely as could have been with a knife, and the slain lay in rows precisely as they had stood in the ranks a few minutes before. So that really just talks about this swift nature of this new type of combat and the new weapons. There was so much firepower that it was just mowing down this corn. It just paints, I think, a pretty vivid picture of what the battle was like to some extent. Here we are going to take a quick step over to the Western theater of this now. This is just a map of the movements. The fighting actually starts here at Fort Henry and Donelson here, and then ultimately moves to Shiloh, and we're going to be talking about that here in a second. But this is just obviously the difference between the Western theater and the Eastern theater. So the Eastern theater is taking place in this kind of circle where I make with my mouse right here, just to see the the proximity and where this all kind of fell up. So the Western theater, what's the point of the Western theater? What are they trying to accomplish here? And really the ultimate Union objective was to control the rivers by the belief, in controlling these major rivers. It's going to, hinder and mess up the Confederate, ability to make war by hurting their shipping and movement of supplies and such. So that's what they aim to do, and the man for the job is Ulysses S. Grant. He is in control here in the command. He is a West Point graduate. He actually had resigned the Army in 1854. There were allegations of excessive drinking, and he kind of stepped away from it for a little while. But once this war got started, they brought these officers back, and he was ultimately recommissioned for the Civil War. And the first fighting that you have here takes place at Fort Henry and Donelson, as I just said, where I showed you on the map just a second ago in February of 1862. And the whole objective here is to take control of the Tennessee River that these forts are on. And by doing so, by taking control of this part of the river, it's going to open up this path for the push into the South, through these rivers, down the Mississippi River. It's going to push the Confederates out of the border state of Kentucky. Again, what the Confederates were trying to do with the border states, the North does not want that, so they're going to try to get them out of the border states as quickly as they can. And they take control here, and actually not long after, you actually get naval forces taking control of New Orleans as well, and that is majorly important because, as you hopefully know, New Orleans is actually at the mouth of the Mississippi River, and controlling the mouth of the Mississippi River, will allow you to prevent things getting up from the ocean into the river, and ultimately, to Confederate spots along the river. Along New Orleans, you have the ports, obviously major important, and you have big sugar plantations as well that are part of the Confederate economy. That's going to be really important. Ultimately, the Confederates attempt a counterattack at Shiloh. The same time, in early April, trying to regain some of the momentum that they had here. So they surprise attack at Shiloh. It's a Confederate surprise attack, trying to, as I said, gain some momentum and get back the Union and get back some of these spots that they had lost. And this is it's another bloody fight, right? We're talking more than 20,000 casualties. It's a 2-day fight. It's extremely tiresome and daunting for these men. But ultimately, again, the Union emerges victorious as a result of these reinforcements and the shelling from Union naval ships along the river. And by fighting them off here at Shiloh, this narrow victory is ultimately going to then lead to another victory and capture of Memphis, Tennessee, which is also on the Mississippi River. So right now, the North is looking really, really good in the West for sure. So having such a majorly positive thing happen in the West in these battles, and starting to control a major portion of the Mississippi River, and the win at Antietam and repelling the advance, really gives Abraham Lincoln some positive energy, and I guess the ability to put forth the Emancipation Proclamation, which we're going to be saying what that is in a second, but for starters, really, the North's main goal, at least as Lincoln was saying, publicly early in this war, was ultimately to preserve the Union. They wanted to bring the Union back together. That was really why they were fighting. That's why the people wanted to be fighting. And this really was not about slavery initially. Lincoln didn't want it to be about slavery, mostly because the border states still had slaves. So, in acting against slavery could hurt that and turn the border states to the Confederate side and all the resources and the people that go along with it. As far as popularity goes, not everyone in the North was completely anti-slave. Some just didn't care at all, or some actually wanted some slaves, especially in the border states. So if he had acted, the popularity of the war would really have been a lot lower as a result. And there's a quote here from Lincoln, that if I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all of the slaves, I would also do that. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would do that. So that's really just showing how much he really was just all about the preservation of the Union, and the slavery wasn't publicly, at least, an issue for him early in this war. So what is the Emancipation Proclamation? We looked at it completely in class. You read it completely in class. You have a little blurb from it up right here in the top that all persons held as slaves within any state, in rebellion against the United States shall be thenceforth, and forever free. So that's a really important point right there. So they're saying in rebellion against the United States. So what does that mean? Does this free all slaves, everywhere? Does it free them in the North? Does it free them in the South? Border states? What's the deal? So really, ultimately, this only applied to Confederate-controlled area. And that right there is like a whoa for some people. It's like, I thought the Emancipation actually freed everybody, and that's not true. And the reason why this is still important, obviously didn't, immediately free a whole number of slaves, but slavery was a major help in the war effort for the South, whether it was agriculturally, weakening this slavery, what would be a major blow to the Confederacy. And by declaring this emancipation to the slaves in this controlled area, what actually happens now is, as the Union begins to creep into the South, you actually get and take control of these, the southern lands. You get areas that are being taken control of, and with that, the property and the slaves are part of that. So now, as you have the Union Army taking control of these slaves, they're freeing these slaves. In many cases, they're actually just putting them right into the ranks of the army. They're giving them weapons, they're training them, and these become known as contraband, army members. And talking about the illegal nature of them, at least from the southern side, based off of the Emancipation, and this is going to be a blow in the Confederates' attempt to try to get Europe to their side, right? This is an attempt to actually dissuade Europe from recognizing the Confederate States of America as its own entity. You also get Abraham Lincoln acting with an executive order which actually suspends what's known as habeas corpus. And habeas corpus, real quick, is this guarantee that individuals, are going to be getting a hearing and they have a right to a hearing before being jailed. So the big thing about this is that now he's suspending that. Lincoln, is ordering the suspension of this idea that they're going to be, able to have this hearing before they're jailed. It actually orders the arrest of anyone that's interfering with the war effort, whether it's aiding and abetting the Confederate States, it's discouraging men from enlisting, in the army. You could actually be detained by the military. You could have a, military tribunal for a trial. You could be court-martialed, depending on, if you were military or not. And that's a big deal. And this is arguably one of the most controversial things about Lincoln's presidency and the war right here, because it really does go against many of the of the Constitution to some extent. And was it legitimate because it was a time of war? There's all sorts of arguments you could make whether or not this was a good move or a bad move, or if it was a fair move or what. But ultimately, it happened. It's definitely a controversial part of Lincoln's presidency and this war and such. So as I was just saying, a major byproduct of the Emancipation Proclamation is that you now get a large number of black soldiers that are looking to join up. And whether these people were free northern, African Americans, or whether or not were contraband, from the South that were ultimately, captured and brought into, the war effort for the North, the way they were treated initially, that they were fearful of what they would do, in fighting along the whites. And by the end of the war, this is going to be a very different picture of how these men were viewed, especially by Lincoln and some of the generals and such of the military, because you ultimately get 180,000 men fighting for the Union. You have 20,000 plus more fighting for the Navy, and that's a big number. And these men were ultimately effective in the war. They were hard fighting soldiers. They were obviously fighting for something they believed in, and again, something they hated, and they were effective, right? Especially if they were ultimately effectively used by their commanders. A number of these, I should say, came from the emancipated territories, in Tennessee and Mississippi, these valleys along these rivers. I have the number here is 76,000 men actually, were contraband soldiers. In this case, this is more kind of after the war, but service in the Army ultimately, established these men as leaders, these African American soldiers as leaders, and it's going to kind of open up them for political advancement during the Reconstruction era, whether locally as representatives or even nationally in certain cases. Many of these men became leaders during this time, came from the Army. In fact, you even had Navy men actually getting equal pay in certain cases as your white soldiers, and even had promotion opportunities, which was obviously pretty big. You initially you did have the Army in segregated units, which meant that you only had African Americans in the unit, in the regiment. The officers could be abusive. The men actually got lower pay. So if you remember from the movie Glory, the big thing is that they were getting paid $10 a month instead of the $13 a month of a normal enlisted man, and that was obviously a big deal and kind of a slap in the face because they were doing the same work. In many cases, they weren't initially used in combat. In fact, they were put into labor and forced labor in certain cases as a result of the military service, and that's it's kind of ironic considering many of these men had been slaves, and it's kind of just interesting anyway. Also, you had a proclamation by the Confederates that if they were captured by the Confederacy, many of them could be actually sold back into slavery or even executed. But the military service and the actions of these men is going to really push the Republicans in believing in this emancipation completely after the war, and really bringing equal protection of the laws when it comes to it later on during the Reconstruction era. So you did have the two parties in the North, right? You did have Northern Democrats in addition to the Republicans, even though the Republicans were the big party that won the last election here. But the Democrats had kind of split into two camps at the beginning of the war, and many of them supported Lincoln and the war effort. But you also had the peaceful Dems, as they would call themselves, and they became known as the Copperheads. And they really felt that the Union should actually negotiate with the Confederates. They really lost popular support for the war a bit, especially after the Emancipation, and the war became a bit about the freeing of the African Americans here, the freeing of the slaves. So people were worried about the effects of the war and how much it was hurting the economy and such, and the everyday person. And as a result, they were willing to negotiate to some extent, and they wanted to negotiate. And that's one of also the reasons why you also get the habeas corpus, the suspension of the habeas corpus. And that's, as I said, some Republicans actually suspected these guys of actually aiding the Confederates, and that's one of the reasons for the suspension of the habeas corpus. The war does drag on a bit. It definitely feels that way for the men that are fighting it, for sure. And as the result of the war and the popularity of the war kind of declining, for sure, you have the number of volunteering starting to really to drop off. You have the enlisting of the troops becoming a problem. Not really as many people are enlisting, and that is what actually forces the draft. So you start to get conscription laws in the South in particular first, in April of 1862. It's a requirement for men, between the ages of 18 and 35, to serve in the Army for 3 years. You could actually hire a substitute, which means that you could actually pay someone to take your place in the fighting. You could have one man from every family, especially on the plantations, that with 20 or more slaves, to actually be exempt from this, so that it really, in many cases, this is a war in the South that's being fought on the backs of the poor for the wealthy aristocratic class in the South. And that's right. If you can pay for a substitute, someone else will fight the war for you. If you're a rich plantation owner, you actually can be exempt from going to the war as well. And that just kind of highlights that rich man's war on the backs of the poor kind of idea. The North also would have a draft. Initially those bounties you saw on that propaganda poster, those payments for enlistment is going to drop off too, and their draft, ages 20 to 40, all men, you could actually avoid the draft by also hiring a substitute, or even just straight up paying the government $300. And those laws, again, aroused the people and made the people frustrated and angry about what was going on. Many people were, again, no longer supporting the war when the war became about freeing the slaves, less than the preserving of the Union and bringing the Union together. And you get protests erupting in many of the northern cities, and even riots. And the biggest example of this is the New York draft riots. It's a 4-day affair. You have over 100 people killed. You actually have the shelling of the rioters by naval ships from the harbor. You have the military and troops from Gettysburg actually called in to stop these riots. It's a big deal, and they're frustrated. They're attacking African American boarding houses and things like that. They're killing African Americans. Just a lot of people that are very frustrated and angry with the war, and they're really showing it here. The war also really strains economies, just in general. The industrial output and such of both, the devastation that certain areas face, how much economic resources you need to put into the war. It's really straining on these economies, and as a result, both sides are going to need to find money to be able to pay for this. Mostly, they were getting a lot of money and borrowing it through bonds to people in general. A bond being a loan by a person to the government with the promise that the government is going to pay back the loan and interest. It's generally a very safe investment, and this is how much of the money was actually raised. And you have over $2 billion raised in the North for this fight. You have about $700 million in the South, and that's probably a product again of the differences in population and the differences in how these societies made their living, the South being predominantly agricultural compared to the industrial booming North at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. another way of trying to raise money, you actually have the income tax instituted. And even through this, it wasn't enough. And as a result, both sides start printing money. And if you know anything about, economics, that when you start throwing a large number of dollars into the supply, you're going to get what's called inflation. So you get the printing of these dollars, and for the first time, you actually get a step away from the gold standard in the United States. And this for the first time, money is no longer guaranteed and backed by dollars, by gold that the United States actually possesses, and it's actually backed on the promise by the United States that this is actually worth something. And as you start printing more and more of these money, as I said, you begin to actually increase the supply of money, and that leads to a major inflation and the prices of things actually rising. And when that becomes problematic is when the prices actually rise and raise faster than wages. So say, just for an example, if someone makes $50,000 a year and all of their expenses are roughly, I don't know, $2,000 a month, that with inflation, all of a sudden, that though your expenses are $3,000 a month or $4,000 a month, and your wages that you're making actually stay the same, that's when it becomes a major problem, right? You get the general increase in prices, and this is very problematic for the working class people who work in the in the factories and stuff in the North, pumping out goods for the war. And while the economy is actually booming in the North as a result of the industrial needs for the war, and also the farmers are prospering because of the amount of food that needs to be eaten by the army, you still get this inflation hurting these people that the wages don't actually increase for. You get about 80% inflation in the North, which is pretty incredible, but the South was really hurt with this, where you're talking up to 9,000% inflation. That's just pretty crazy when it really comes down to it, and that's going to really hurt the South, obviously. And it did, right? The factories in the South were really overburdened from the war effort. You didn't have so many of them to begin with. The ones that were created and made, didn't really. They lacked the industrial capabilities of the North, with so few of them. It really didn't. They weren't able to cover and provide the necessities for the army that they needed. Again, this war is predominantly being fought in Confederate territory. So, farms are devastated by the war. The rail lines that the South did actually have are devastated by the war as well. Preventing the movement of supplies and such, really affecting the South in the long run for sure. And the blockade, the Anaconda Plan, began to prove even more and more effective as the war went on. And it caused severe shortages in goods needed by the military. And that started to lead to desertion by the men and such, and that was another problem the South faced. So now we're going to be kind of going into the later stages of the war, especially on the eastern the side. You get this some more action here moving on, and the big fights are going to be between Fredericksburg, at Chancellorsville, and then ultimately Gettysburg. And you're just looking at the map here, you can really see how the location of this is going to really affect things, especially at Gettysburg. And we're going to explain why, but I just want to show you before we move on here how close Gettysburg is to some major Union cities. Right, it's not that far from Washington D.C. It's not that far from Philadelphia, which would be kind of right around here. New York City is obviously also not too far. So that's big, right? If the Confederacy was able to win here, it might actually force a coming to terms by the Union as a result of the proximity to these big cities. So Fredericksburg, what happens here is you actually have an attack. It's an attack by the Union, and that gets beaten, gets repelled completely, and it just forces them back, the Union back. They're attacking this entrenched position, these defensible positions, and they get devastated. Burnside was the general in charge here at the time. He's actually resigns after this in kind of embarrassment, and that actually gives Lee idea and they believe it a good idea to start kind of pushing now into Union territory again. So at Chancellorsville, you actually have Lee win another victory, over the Union, which is again a big surprise and a big showing the differences between the two troops here. And you actually have General Hooker, who had taken over. He does not, obviously doesn't do such a great job here, but you get large casualties on both sides. But, this win here at Chancellorsville actually allows the Confederates to build up the momentum that it needs to ultimately push north to Gettysburg. And Gettysburg is the real deal. Gettysburg is actually the largest battle that's ever been fought on the North American continent. If you actually go through the notes, you can watch a small little video by clicking on the link about the battle in a bit more specific detail. But this is a really important move by the Confederacy. What they're really hoping to do here is by actually pushing into Union territory, and if they were able to actually win a battle here, it would actually force the North's hand, and the hopes that they would actually be able to come to terms with the North and negotiate for their freedom is what they're really hoping here. Their freedom, of being able to be their own Confederate States of America, completely independent from the Union, and it could have gone either way. This battle was pretty big, and it was a course of a couple days, and it really could have gone any way. There's the big move here at the end, and this is really the downfall of the Confederate Army here, and arguably Robert E. Lee's biggest mistake he makes is what's known as Pickett's charge. He completely throwing caution to the wind a bit. Robert E. Lee forces his group, his men to attack an entrenched Union position across this giant open field. They're just getting picked off by artillery and the rifles left and right, and it really hurts the Confederacy, hurts the men. You get a large number of people killed here, and they kind of lose that momentum that they had and any real hope of coming to terms at this point anyway with the Union. You get the Gettysburg Address by Abraham Lincoln a bit later that we read in class, so you can read the handout again, talking about this war and the biggest honor to these men that they could show is ultimately finishing and completing this war effort and bringing the South fully back into the Union. So now a quick move back to the west here, and this is just a map, again, of the Western Theater, down the Mississippi River. We're going to be talking really about Vicksburg here, because this is happening roughly the same time as Gettysburg. It's a couple months of a siege of this town on these bluffs above the Mississippi River, but the winning by the Union here happens at roughly the same time as Gettysburg. In fact, the victory is July 4th here in 1863, whereas the victory was July 3rd in Gettysburg. So in just a matter of 2 days, you have two huge Union victories that are really going to be a major turning point in this war and really kind of push it toward its final conclusion once and for all. So Vicksburg was, as I said, this multiple-month siege by Ulysses S. Grant. It's above, these cliffs. This is just an artist rendering down here. You can see, you have this cliffs above the river. The Union Army here, kind of laying siege to the men at this area, and it's. It happens. It's a big deal. It's a long fight. They're trying to starve out these Confederates. Grant is constantly worried about reinforcements and people trying to push them off this siege and allowing the men to link up, the Confederate men to link up with other reinforcements. But ultimately, Grant is successful here. They take the town, and you get 30,000 Confederate troops surrendering, and that's a big deal. And you have Ulysses S. Grant as the victor at Vicksburg, ultimately getting the attention that Lincoln was finally looking to give. Lincoln, praised Ulysses S. Grant for finally being the general to fight the war in a way that made sense to Lincoln based off of the advantages of the North. Grant's actually going to be labeled a butcher because of his strategies, but his strategies, you can't deny, were effective, and he is looking to fight a war of attrition here. He's willing to take high casualty numbers to inflict high casualty numbers. He knows of the number advantage between the North and the South, and with over 2 million men, fighting in the North throughout the war, and just over 1 million, the 2-to-1 advantage is a big deal. So if you just are willing to continuously attack and continuously inflict large numbers of casualties on the Confederacy, while still doing it to yourself a little bit, but most importantly to the Confederacy, if you just keep doing that, you're going to eventually wear them down and crack them. So Grant, he, as I said, gets labeled as Butcher. He has assaults at battles of Wilderness, at Spotsylvania Court, Cold Harbor in Virginia, and it just, as I said, just continue. I don't really need to expect you to know those battles off the top of your head, but it's just a continuous pounding and pounding and pounding, taking tremendous casualties, but dishing out the tremendous casualties necessary to really hurt the Southern war effort. And, the question really becomes, is this acceptable? Is this okay? And, you can't really deny the effectiveness of it, but he is, many of his men are being killed. So it's really, that's the question. Is this okay from a moral standpoint? It wins the war here, and that's really obviously pretty important too. You actually have another siege to cut off Richmond, 9 months this time. I mean, as opposed to the couple months that you had at Vicksburg. At the town of Petersburg, cutting off Richmond once and for all here. That's going to be obviously a big. So one thing that's really needs to be mentioned is that Abraham Lincoln actually was needed to run for re-election throughout this war. The war starts right at the beginning of his presidency, and it lasts through him having to be re-elected. It's just part of the system. The elections are 4 years, and they have the election. Actually, it's funny because Lincoln is now going against George McClellan, who is the general that was the big thorn in Lincoln's side for not being the one to act and being overly cautious early in this war. And Lincoln, was 100%, for continuing this Union effort, whereas McClellan wasn't really as dedicated to the war effort, and it can be argued that this was actually one of the best chances for the South to really win this war, or at least win what they were hoping to get out of the war, because if Lincoln had lost here, and it was close, especially early on in this election cycle, and the way the popularity was because of how unpopular the war had become after the Emancipation, and now the large casualty numbers and such, and the inflation and the draft riots, and all of those problems, the war had become unpopular. So if McClellan had won here, he might have actually been willing to negotiate with the Confederate States to allow, to get to the terms that the Confederates were looking for. And, Lincoln's chances weren't great, as I was saying, until you get this other big turning point of the war, when William Tecumseh Sherman takes Atlanta after another big siege in September of 1864, and this actually bolsters Lincoln's support enough to win with 55% of the vote. And you can see right here is an electoral college map of how kind of things went, this is the popular vote right here. The electoral vote swung wildly in favor of Lincoln, but as far as numbers going, it went McClellan's. It could have gone McClellan's way. It wasn't that it could have gone McClellan's way if Atlanta had not happened. And William Tecumseh Sherman really is going to get a reputation for being absolutely ruthless and brutal, kind of using a total war strategy to culminate his campaign through much of this Confederate territory here. And it's going to become known as Sherman's March to the Sea. He makes a beeline, essentially, from these captures, from Atlanta especially, straight to the ocean at Savannah here, and really cutting a complete swath of destruction in his path, destroying everything useful for the South, destroying farmland, raiding these plantations. One thing becomes known as these Sherman's bow ties, that they would heat up the railroad lines and they would tie them into bows, essentially leaving them completely unusable. They lived off the land, and eventually they get across the South here to the sea, and they eventually join to rush north and head to with Grant, going to into Virginia, hopefully hoping to kind of crush the Confederate army from the opposite side once and for all. And you have this quote here that, right, we are not only fighting hostile armies, but we're fighting a hostile people, and we must make old, young, rich, and poor feel the hard hand of war. Now, that's a pretty tough quote. Talking about the people need to suffer as much as the fighting people, because they are helping the war effort. They're hostile to the Union troops, and that's one of the reasons why this brutal tactics that Sherman employs going through the South. Here is just an artist rendering of Sherman on his horse, going through one of these towns, really laying fire to them as they go, burning things up, and just kind of, as I said, cutting that swath of destruction in his path, to Savannah, to ultimately head north to join the rest of the Union. So after Lincoln wins his election, it's kind of time to start looking toward the future of this country, and realizing now the importance of winning this war and really bringing the South back into the Union and bringing them back in effectively. And he speaks of repairing the wounds caused by the war. And you can see one of the quotes from this address right here, right? With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. And Lincoln is going to be all really about doing whatever necessary to kind of heal up these wounds and bring the Confederacy back into the Union in a somewhat of a lenient way, I suppose, just trying to not really rub in the fact that they lost this war, and to keep that hostility going. They want to obviously to ease those hostilities and allow these wounds to recover. So we're really coming to the end here now, and General Lee is going to be forced to surrender the Confederate Army at a place called Appomattox Courthouse. And you have the Union to take the capital at Richmond, and while Lee is trying to flee General Sherman, they get caught by the rest of the Union Army, and they're forced to surrender. And lastly, the couple days later, you get the remaining Confederate troops, surrendering to General Sherman, and ultimately the capture of Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president. So here is just a picture of the surrendering. It's not a picture, sorry. It's a painting of the surrender here at Appomattox Courthouse. You have General Lee and Grant, coming to terms here of the surrender and the surrender happening. So the results and the lasting implications and lasting impact of this war are going to be seen and going to have a tremendous effect on the country going forward. For sure, you have almost 700,000 American lives lost throughout the course of this war, and that is tremendous loss of life. It's going to have a major effect economically. It's going to have a major effect socially. You have billions of dollars worth of damage to the South, and that's going to cause a bitter resentment. They don't want to be joining the Union in the first place. They obviously left. They don't want to be coming back, and they're going to be forced to join back after losing this war. You have millions of slaves being freed, which is obviously a major deal against the South, especially because their economies were based off of these slaves and the agriculture, and we're going to be talking about how these freed slaves are going to interact with the economy in the South going forward when we talk about Reconstruction. But really, the lasting impacts really set the tone for the course the country is going to take in the future, and really the industrial nation, the industrial North, kind of going to be now spreading out, and the Industrial Revolution going to be, the effects of the Industrial Revolution going to be seen really all the way throughout the country. So thanks for listening.